Yeah, and so I posted a screen grab where, Candace was talking with a former employee of mine and saying, my first question ahead of the December 15th meeting that they had in Nashville is going to be, why did you murder your husband? So I posted that, and I think that's what Pete is referring to.
One clip, one emotional reaction, one sentence that sent the internet down a rabbit hole. That is how this entire situation surrounding Turning Point USA suddenly exploded into something much larger than ordinary political drama. Because at first, most people thought this was just another internet fight inside the conservative media world. A few live stream arguments, some accusations flying back and forth online, a growing conflict involving Candace Owens, supporters of Erica Kirk, and several personalities connected to the broader TPUSA ecosystem. But then viewers started paying attention to one specific figure, Andrew Colvett. For people outside conservative political circles, the name probably meant absolutely nothing. He was not the public face of a movement. He was not a major elected official. He was not some nationally recognizable celebrity commentator constantly appearing on cable television. And yet somehow, Andrew Colvett appeared deeply embedded within the inner communication structure surrounding Turning Point USA after the death of Charlie Kirk. That alone caught attention online. But what really accelerated the situation was a live stream clip that quickly spread across social media platforms. In the clip, Colvett aggressively pushes back against speculation and criticism directed toward Erica Kirk. At one point, he essentially says that if people want to come after Erica, they will have to go through him and others around her first.
Is if you're going to come for Erica Kirk, you're going to start having to go through me, Blake, and the rest of us, because I'm sick of it, and I'm sick of Charlie's widow getting attacked senselessly.
Now, supporters viewed this as loyalty. Critics viewed it very differently, because the intensity of the defense immediately triggered a wave of online questions. Why was Colvett so personally invested? Why did he sound less like a distant communications figure and more like someone deeply involved inside the organization's inner circle?
Erica should be arrested. That
she's a robot.
If this evidence was against anyone else, they would be on trial, which has been said. If they're saying she's part of a conspiracy, they are saying that she did it. Period. And I'm not going to accept any nonsense saying otherwise.
Correct.
And perhaps most importantly, how many people surrounding Turning Point USA were connected behind the scenes in ways the public had never fully understood before? That was the moment everything started changing. Because once internet researchers, independent commentators, and politically obsessed Twitter users started looking into Andrew Colvett's background, they discovered that his connections stretched far beyond a normal media staff position. One name appeared almost immediately: Johnny Moore. And that name opened an entirely new door. Because Johnny Moore is not just another conservative activist floating around Republican media circles. Over the last decade, he has quietly built influence across evangelical organizations, political communications firms, media operations, donor networks, and pro-Israel advocacy spaces deeply connected to the American conservative movement. According to publicly available reporting and organizational histories, Colvett previously worked within Moore's orbit through a strategic communications and PR organization called Kairos Company. At first glance, that may not sound particularly shocking. Political organizations hire communication specialists all the time. PR firms move between campaigns, activist groups, churches, conferences, media organizations, and nonprofits constantly. In Washington, political culture especially, nearly everyone seems connected to everyone else eventually. But critics online began arguing that the overlap surrounding Kairos, TPUSA, evangelical media networks, and several pro-Israel organizations looked unusually concentrated. And the deeper people looked, the more connections they found. Kairos itself reportedly operated far beyond traditional press relations. The company built influence within conservative Christian media spaces, public advocacy campaigns, faith-based political outreach, and high-level communication strategy.
The Kairos Company is the primary strategic communications and public relations partner for Turning Point USA. All right? Johnny Moore, the founder of Kairos, remains a key advisor to Turning Point USA's new leadership under CEO Erica Kirk. He and his firm have been credited with managing the high-stakes media strategy during the transition, focusing on stabilizing the movement and amplifying its mission.
Over time, it became associated with prominent evangelical figures and major conservative political personalities operating within the broader Republican ecosystem. That alone would not necessarily create controversy, but then viewers noticed something else. The same names kept appearing repeatedly across multiple organizations, the same media companies, the same strategists, the same evangelical leaders, the same political influencers, the same communications consultants. And suddenly, what started as internet drama surrounding TPUSA began transforming into a much larger conversation about influence, messaging, and the hidden architecture of modern political media networks. Because many critics online no longer believed they were simply observing random professional relationships. They believed they were looking at a tightly interconnected communications ecosystem operating across politics, religion, digital media, and public influence simultaneously. And once that theory started spreading online, people began tracing the network outward even further. That is when they arrived at organizations tied to international messaging campaigns, FARA filings, major Republican political operatives, and media structures designed specifically for mass online influence in the algorithm era. But before getting there, it is important to understand how influential Johnny Moore's position inside conservative evangelical politics had already become. Because according to critics following this story, Moore may represent one of the most important connective figures in the entire network, not because he dominates headlines, but because he appears connected to nearly every major layer of the ecosystem itself. To understand why so many people online became fixated on Johnny Moore, you first have to understand the role modern evangelical influence plays inside American conservative politics. Because for decades, evangelical organizations have not simply operated as religious communities. They have also functioned as fundraising networks, media ecosystems, voter mobilization machines, activist pipelines, and messaging structures capable of reaching millions of Americans simultaneously. And few people appear more deeply connected inside that world than Johnny Moore. Over the years, Moore built relationships across conservative churches, Republican political organizations, donor circles, media companies, and pro-Israel advocacy initiatives.
The internal connections, as you can see there at the bottom. Former Kairos executive Andrew Colvett remains a central figure. Why can't I read that? Gosh darn it. Remains a central figure at Turning Point USA, further solidifying. Sorry, this keeps getting off my screen. Further solidifying the long-term professional bond between the two organizations. Okay, so Andrew Colvett is obviously a key player, and he is a former Kairos employee. He was recruited by Johnny Moore.
Publicly, he often positioned himself as a bridge between evangelical Christianity and support for Israel within American politics. Critics online argue that role became incredibly significant after the rise of social media-driven political influence, because modern political movements no longer depend entirely on traditional television networks. Instead, they rely on interconnected ecosystems involving podcasts, live streams, church events, conferences, influencers, donor-funded organizations, digital campaigns, and public relations operations, all reinforcing similar narratives across multiple platforms at once. And according to people following this story online, Kairos Company appeared deeply embedded within that exact ecosystem. The company itself reportedly specialized in strategic communications, public image management, faith-based outreach, and political messaging. Over time, Kairos became connected to major evangelical personalities and organizations operating inside the conservative movement. That alone would not necessarily create suspicion, but then researchers online began noticing timeline overlaps that they considered unusual. According to several reports and public accounts, Andrew Colvett entered the Kairos orbit before eventually becoming closely associated with Turning Point USA and Charlie Kirk. Around that same broader period, TPUSA itself was rapidly transforming from a college conservative activist organization into one of the most powerful youth-oriented political movements inside modern American conservatism. The organization expanded aggressively through conferences, influencer culture, social media content, campus activism, donor relationships, and faith-adjacent messaging increasingly aimed at younger conservative audiences online. And this is where critics believe the overlap begins looking far more strategic than accidental, because suddenly the same communication structures seem to appear everywhere. Media amplification, evangelical outreach, political branding, digital influence, narrative management, public relations coordination, and all of those elements appeared connected through overlapping personalities and organizations operating within the same orbit. Then another major development pushed the controversy even further. In 2025, Moore became publicly associated with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, an American and Israeli-backed humanitarian organization operating during the intensifying Middle East conflict. Supporters described the foundation as a legitimate humanitarian effort focused on aid distribution and international coordination. Critics viewed it differently. Some argued the organization also served an important public relations role by helping shape how American audiences emotionally interpreted the conflict and Israeli policy responses. Whether that criticism is fair or not is heavily debated, but what matters for this story is that Moore's position suddenly placed him at the intersection of religion, politics, media strategy, and international messaging all at once. And according to critics online, that intersection may be the key to understanding everything else that followed. Because once people started tracing the communication networks outward from Moore and Kairos, they arrived at another extremely important figure: Brad Parscale. Most Americans first heard the name Brad Parscale during Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. At the time, Parscale became famous for helping pioneer an entirely new style of political communication built around aggressive social media targeting, viral online content, digital advertising, and data-driven messaging strategies designed specifically for the internet era. In many ways, critics and supporters alike viewed him as one of the architects of modern online political campaigning. But nearly a decade later, Parscale's name started resurfacing in a completely different conversation. This time, it involved foreign influence filings, AI-era media strategy, and online narrative shaping connected to Israeli government interests. And that is where this story takes another major turn. According to public FARA filings and multiple reports circulating online, Parscale became associated with a communications effort tied to a company called Clock Tower X. Reports surrounding the filings describe digital outreach campaigns focused heavily on younger online audiences, especially across platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and algorithm-driven media ecosystems where public opinion now spreads faster than traditional news coverage. That alone generated controversy. But the reason people online became so fascinated by the situation was because critics believed the strategy extended far beyond normal advertising or public relations. According to critics following the filings, the broader objective appeared focused on influencing how information itself spreads online in the AI and algorithm era. Now, to be fair, governments, corporations, nonprofits, and activist organizations all attempt to shape public opinion. That has always existed. But critics argue modern influence campaigns operate very differently than they did even 10 years ago. Instead of relying only on television commercials or newspaper editorials, modern messaging ecosystems now spread through search algorithms, recommendation systems, podcasts, influencers, live stream clips, social media trends, AI-generated summaries, and interconnected digital amplification across dozens of platforms simultaneously. And according to people studying these filings online, that is exactly why Clock Tower X became so controversial. Because critics argue whoever influences the online information ecosystem increasingly influences what millions of people emotionally interpret as reality itself. Then people discovered another connection. Parscale was also tied to Salem Media Group, one of the most influential conservative Christian media organizations in the United States. That mattered enormously, because suddenly the same network began appearing again: Salem Media, Johnny Moore, Kairos Company. Evangelical outreach, political influence campaigns, digital media ecosystems. And according to critics online, these were no longer isolated relationships accidentally overlapping in the same political world. Instead, they appeared to form a highly interconnected communication structure stretching across religion, politics, media strategy, online influence, and public narrative management simultaneously. Johnny Moore appeared regularly across Salem-affiliated media platforms. Conservative faith audiences became central targets for messaging outreach. Political influencers amplified similar narratives online. And organizations connected to media strategy increasingly overlapped with organizations involved in ideological activism and public persuasion campaigns. Again, none of this proves the existence of some secret conspiracy operating behind closed doors. But critics argue the density of the overlap itself is what makes the situation remarkable. Because by this point, many online commentators no longer believed they were simply observing ordinary political networking. They believed they were watching the emergence of a modern influence machine specifically designed for the digital age. And then another name entered the picture: Chad Schnittker. Compared to names like Brad Parscale or Johnny Moore, Chad Schnittker was not someone most casual political viewers had ever heard of before this controversy started spreading online. But according to critics researching the broader network surrounding these organizations, Schnitker became important because of what his work allegedly represented. Not traditional politics, not campaign rallies, not cable news, but direct ideological outreach into American church communities themselves. According to reports tied to multiple outreach campaigns, Schnitker became associated with efforts focused heavily on evangelical audiences through traveling exhibits, digital media campaigns, Christian college events, and church-centered messaging connected to the Middle East conflict. And this is where the pattern became impossible for many online observers to ignore, because the same target audience appeared repeatedly across nearly every layer of the network. Young conservatives, evangelical Christians, faith-based voters, Republican activist communities, online conservative influencers, podcast audiences, church networks, social media ecosystems. And critics argue that once all of those pieces are viewed together simultaneously, the structure begins looking far more coordinated than random. Now, to be fair, political organizations naturally cooperate with churches, media companies, donors, influencers, and activist communities all the time. That is not unusual in American politics. But critics following this story argue the density of the overlap is what makes the situation remarkable. Because no matter which direction people looked, the same organizations and personalities seemed to appear again and again. Kairos Company, Salem Media, Turning Point USA, Evangelical Outreach Initiatives, digital communications strategists, political influencers, Israel advocacy campaigns, Republican activist networks, and eventually, many researchers online started doing something extremely important. They stopped looking at the controversy as individual disconnected events. Instead, they began mapping the relationships visually. And according to critics, that was the moment the situation started looking dramatically different, because connection maps circulating online suddenly showed what appeared to be a highly interconnected ecosystem stretching across politics, religion, media infrastructure, influencer culture, digital outreach, and public persuasion campaigns simultaneously. One PR firm connected to multiple organizations, one media company connected to multiple messaging campaigns, one influencer appearing across multiple platforms, one strategist tied to several separate operations at once. And sitting near the center of many of those overlapping relationships were the same few names viewers had already been hearing repeatedly throughout this entire story. Then the conversation expanded even further, because people started tracing parts of the network directly into the broader Trump political orbit. That included relationships involving conservative faith leaders, donor circles, campaign strategists, media personalities, and figures who had operated close to Donald Trump's political movement for years. One of the names most frequently mentioned in that wider discussion was Paula White, a longtime Trump spiritual advisor deeply connected to evangelical political organizing. And according to critics online, once those Trump world connections entered the picture, the controversy surrounding Turning Point USA no longer looked like isolated internet drama at all. It started looking like part of something much larger. What makes this entire story so fascinating is that it may actually represent something much bigger than any single organization, personality, or political controversy. Because underneath all the names, all the live stream clips, all the screenshots, and all the online arguments, there is a much larger question emerging. How is public opinion shaped in the digital age? That question sits at the center of everything people have been debating surrounding Turning Point USA, Johnny Moore, Brad Parscale, Salem Media Group, and the broader network critics believe connects them all together. Because many online researchers argue that modern influence no longer operates the way it did 20 years ago. Back then, political messaging mostly moved through television networks, newspapers, radio stations, and official campaign advertisements. Today, influence spreads completely differently, through podcasts, through live stream clips, through TikTok algorithms, through viral Twitter arguments, through influencer commentary, through YouTube recommendations, through search engines, through AI-generated summaries, through online outrage cycles that move faster than traditional journalism can even react. And critics argue that whoever understands those systems best may now possess enormous power over public perception itself. That is why discussions surrounding AI-driven messaging strategies and digital influence campaigns suddenly became such a major part of this controversy. Because according to critics studying these networks, modern narrative management is no longer just about convincing people what to think. It is about influencing what information they even encounter in the first place. What videos get amplified, what topics trend, what stories disappear, which personalities become trusted, which voices become marginalized, which narratives algorithms reward. And according to online commentators following this story, the organizations connected to this network appear unusually sophisticated when it comes to operating inside those digital systems. That does not automatically mean illegal coordination. It does not prove secret conspiracies, and it certainly does not mean every person involved shares identical goals or motivations. But critics argue the overlap still matters, because by this point, the network surrounding these organizations appears deeply integrated across politics, religion, media strategy, influencer ecosystems, and digital communications infrastructure simultaneously. And that is why the controversy surrounding Erica Kirk and Turning Point USA evolved into something much larger than internal organizational drama. For many observers online, the story became symbolic of a broader transformation happening across modern politics itself. A transformation where information warfare no longer looks like propaganda from the past. It looks like podcasts. It looks like influencers. It looks like algorithms. It looks like viral clips. And most importantly, it looks almost invisible while it is happening. And maybe that is the biggest reason this story continues gaining attention online. Because for many viewers, this no longer feels like a controversy centered only around Turning Point USA or the people immediately surrounding it. Instead, it feels like a rare glimpse into how modern influence systems actually operate behind the scenes in the digital era. Not through dramatic movie-style conspiracies, not through secret underground meetings, but through overlapping ecosystems, shared media spaces, strategic partnerships, political branding, religious outreach, digital amplification, and communication networks so interconnected that the average person rarely notices them while they are functioning in real time. That is the conclusion many critics online have gradually arrived at while tracing the relationships surrounding Andrew Colvett, Johnny Moore, Brad Parscale, Salem Media Group, and the broader communications ecosystem tied to conservative political activism. Because according to critics, the most important part of this entire situation is not whether every individual inside the network consciously coordinates every action together. The important part is the infrastructure itself, the relationships, the audience pipelines, the media access, the donor connections, the algorithmic reach, the influencer amplification, the ability to move narratives quickly and repeatedly across multiple platforms simultaneously. Critics argue that kind of infrastructure becomes incredibly powerful in an age where millions of people increasingly form political opinions through social media clips, podcasts, live streams, viral posts, and AI-generated search summaries rather than traditional journalism. And once people online started looking at the situation through that lens, many believed they were no longer simply analyzing isolated political organizations. They believed they were observing the architecture of modern digital persuasion itself. Now, supporters of these organizations would likely argue there is nothing unusual happening at all. Political movements naturally build media ecosystems. Religious organizations naturally participate in political advocacy. Influencers naturally collaborate with activist groups, and communications firms naturally work with organizations that share similar ideological goals. All of that is true. But critics argue the overlap here still deserves scrutiny because the same relatively small collection of organizations and personalities appears repeatedly across so many layers of political communication at once. And in the age of algorithms, critics believe that concentration of influence matters more than ever before. Because modern political power may no longer belong only to elected officials. It may belong to whoever best understands how information spreads online, who controls visibility, who controls amplification, who controls narrative momentum, and perhaps most importantly, who controls the emotional framing surrounding the stories millions of people consume every day. Whether viewers ultimately see these connections as coincidence, strategic networking, ideological alignment, or something much larger entirely is up to them. But one thing is undeniable. People are paying attention now. The connections are being mapped, the filings are being examined, the media relationships are being questioned, and the conversation surrounding digital influence, political messaging, and online narrative control is only becoming louder from here. What do you think about this entire network of connections? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with others following the story.